Hello, everyone. Today is Thursday, October 20th, and this is the Cluster API Provider Azure Office Hours. If you're joining us for the first time, there's an agenda link in the Slack channel. If you don't have access, you need to join the SIG Cluster Lifecycle mailing list. And please be aware that we are a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle, and we abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct. So essentially just be nice and respectful to everyone. And if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand with the raise hand feature on Zoom. All right, if you have any agenda items or questions or anything that you'd like to add, please feel free to add them to the agenda under open discussion topics. And if you'd like, you can add your name to the attendee list. That helps us track who's coming to these. And then also like for reaching out to people afterwards, if we have follow-ups, this is optional. And so before we get started, we always give a bit of time at the beginning. If anyone's new to this group and wants to say hi and just kind of introduce themselves and tell us a bit about why they're here. So I will take a pause here. And if anyone wants to say hello and introduce themselves, please go for it.
Hello, everybody. Here is Saverio Prato. I work at Microsoft and I will be working on this API for the next weeks at least. So I thought it was a good idea to jump in the meeting, introduce myself, and look what's going on. That's it. I dropped the microphone for the next person.
Awesome, welcome. Anyone else wants to say hello? All right. I don't see any hands raised, so let's keep going. Okay, so we have a pretty AKS managed cluster focused agenda today. That being said, if anyone else has anything else they'd like to discuss or anything at all, any questions for the project, please add them. Yeah, let's get started with the first two topics that Jack added. And I think a few people are here for that too. So Jack, take it away.
Okay, cool. I would echo what Cecile is saying. If you drop by to ask a question, actually now would be a good time to just ask that question. Otherwise, you'll be at the end of a line that might be 20 minutes long. Cool. Should I share screen or do you want to? I was going to present the PR. Would it be?
Yeah, for sure. Let me give you co-host so you can do that. All right, go for it.
Okay, setting my do not disturb. Okay, cool. All right, let's see. Can you see my Safari browser window with CAPC managed Kubernetes evolution proposal? I think that's the first thing on the agenda. All right, great. So a little background is for folks who don't know the sort of whole story here is hopefully this link works. All right, great. So in the past several months, the CAPI community at large, the Cluster API community, has been discussing how to guide new implementations of managed Kubernetes. So managed Kubernetes is EKS, AKS, GKE in the CAPI ecosystem. And so Winnie did a bunch of great work landing this proposal with the help of other folks to sort of codify a set of recommendations for these new implementations of managed Kubernetes. And going back a little bit further, the justification for this becoming a key topic was the observation, a couple observations. One, that the Azure provider, the CAPZ and Kappa, the AWS provider, had gone in slightly different directions when implementing AKS and EKS respectively. And also very specifically for the EKS implementation, for the Kappa implementation, there was a the sort of choices that were made, which made sense at the time for Kappa, ended up not being compatible with cluster class when it arrived. I think they sort of arrived in parallel, or maybe cluster class arrived later. And so it was a way of sort of having a retrospective about how the API can be better designed so that things like that can't happen in the future to these implementations. And I'll just hand wave around why this is interesting for managed Kubernetes versus self-managed Kubernetes. I'm happy to talk offline or answer questions if folks have specific questions, but there are a lot of differences, which is why this is a sort of more interesting API challenge for the managed Kubernetes solutions versus the sort of just raw self-managed infrastructure solutions. Okay, so that being the background, that PR landed, which states a set of recommendations that deviate a little bit from the current CAPZ managed Kubernetes API specification. And so this PR attempts to kind of clarify what those are. And so I would love for folks who have a stake in Azure Managed Cluster to read over this and critically evaluate what I'm stating here, and we can make this better. And really the goal of this PR is to sort of create a historical record for why or why not the CAPZ project will make any sort of near-term actionable changes based on the recommendations in that CAPI proposal. So the primary recommendations for the CAPI proposal are that the cluster, so there, for folks who aren't familiar, I appreciate your patience, but I think there are at least some folks who are into the weeds enough to understand what this is. So the primary outcome of the proposal is to define a unique set of responsibilities between the two main custom resource definition resources that at least Kappa and CAPZ originally shipped with. So this is now codified, and it's also part of the CAPI spec. Long story short, you want a cluster CRD that represents your managed Kubernetes solution, and you want a control plane CRD. And so this is more or less copy pasted from that CAPI proposal. And it offers hopefully a brief sort of expression of what that distinction is. So control plane specific configurations would go in this control plane CRD, and cluster specific configurations would go into this cluster CRD. So CAPZ already has something sort of like this for Azure Managed Cluster. The main violation of the spirit of that recommendation is that we are putting all of the configuration in the control plane CRD. And so if we were to spike on a set of improvements, assuming that we deem that this proposal amounts to that for CAPZ, for the Azure Managed Cluster effort, then what we would end up doing in reality is moving a bunch of the properties that are in Azure Managed Cluster. I don't think I have anything copy pasted here, but you can imagine that in the Azure case, Azure Managed Control Plane here has all the configuration. Azure Managed Cluster is more of like a sort of referential key that fulfills the CAPI spec, so it doesn't really carry any configuration. So a lot of this stuff up here would go down here, which is a breaking change and would have all kinds of consequences, but would have the benefit, which I'm trying to express here, of being slightly more sort of semantically significant from a human's perspective, because the concepts cluster and control plane have some sort of semantic significance. And we are, as a sort of cluster API citizen, I think it's arguable that we are sort of more compatible. So there are some advantages there. The disadvantages really amount to two key things. One is that it's going to break existing situations, and so that would have to be accounted for. Two, it's going to be a lot of work, and the breakage is actually going to make that a lot of work quotient even greater. Quotient might be the wrong word. Product, I should say. So yeah, I don't necessarily need to go through this in detail, but I think from a high level, it would be maybe a good time to answer questions and have a little bit of a discussion around if anyone has any sort of opinions that they can carry into this meeting about the benefits of moving CAPZ towards this sort of platonic ideal as defined by that CAPI proposal. I would really love to hear that, because as I said, it's going to be a lot of work and we're going to necessarily break the API spec. So the reason we should do that is because the community really wants us to do that. So I'd love to hear that from the community. And if anyone has any just general comments, now would be a good time to try to see if I can follow the raise hands. If I can't, Cecile, please go ahead and call on someone.
Richard.
Okay, Richard.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, that's really interesting, because I guess when we wrote that managed proposal, we explicitly put in a recommendation that sort of was geared towards Kappa CAPZ's current implementations. So i.e. not to force any changes upon providers, just purely for the reasons you listed. There's lots of people potentially using it and it's quite painful. I guess CAPZ is the one question I have is AKS is still experimental as far as the API definitions go. Is that right?
100% right, correct.
Okay, cool. So that's a bit easier. So in Kappa, we moved out of experimental at the same time that we decided to go down to one resource kind for the control plane and the cluster. So it's going to be a lot.
Yeah, so I'm sorry if I'm suggesting that this is painful for CAPZ. You're saying it's an order of magnitude more painful for Kappa.
Potentially. So we haven't decided how we're going to do this at the moment. So I think from a Kappa point of view, we are going to go short term back to the original implementation, which basically followed what you do. So we originally had an AWS managed cluster that satisfied the contract and basically just passed through the values from the control plane, because that would get us over the initial supporting cluster class. So we've actually discussed a couple of different options to get us to, I guess, the recommendation from the proposal. One of them being that we actually introduce completely new API types. So for Kappa, because they are graduated, essentially, we're wondering whether it's just easier to go, instead of calling it AWS Managed Control Plane, EKS control plane and stuff like that to start with. But I think, I guess from chatting with users in Kappa, one of the main areas of confusion that they have is, so I'm putting all of this networking stuff, for example, on the control plane, but really that is, infrastructure. And if I'm using an unmanaged Kubernetes cluster, that's sitting on the cluster, but for a
that's the human semantic, sort of, I would say, point of friction right now. It's cognitively confusing why certain configurations are, you could argue, in the wrong place. So that would be a definite benefit to making this change. Yeah.
So I think but I guess from a Kappa point of view, we are going to take our time and we're going to move to back to the model that you have short term, because we actually copied the AKS implementation when we first started out. So we're going to move there first and then work out how we're actually going to get to the recommended way. But
right, that's extremely interesting and useful. Thank you so much for sharing all that, Richard.
And also, I guess I'm just starting the GKE implementation in CAPG. We are going straight to the recommendation for the GKE implementation. So again, if AKS and EKS stay with this current model and GKE is on the recommended model, it's we don't have that consistency. So it's probably just good to know as well.
Super good to know. Cecile?
So the way I understand it, and my understanding might be limited, this is like mostly from reading the proposals, but it seems like there isn't really any benefit that users of CAPZ would gain by moving to this model, except consistency. Because right now we have something that's working, we have something that's compatible with cluster class. It does match this real state of things in AKS, like there isn't a separate control plane and cluster API or object when you actually create an AKS cluster. So it does make sense logically in that sense. And if we were to make these changes, it would be breaking for everyone who's already using it. But if we don't make these changes and then we decide later, like next year, we want to make these changes, it's going to be even more breaking because there are going to be more people using it and potentially we're going to be not experimental anymore. Hopefully by then we would be non-experimental. So I guess my only concern is like, if we decide to do this now or to not do this now, I would want to make sure that there isn't going to be anything in the future that forces us to do it. Like if CAPI is saying this is just a recommendation, you don't have to follow it now, that's fine as long as it stays that way. But if we ever get to a point where like both CAPG and Kappa are doing something different from CAPZ and CAPZ is like the special snowflake, I wouldn't want something to go into CAPI that is like, well, CAPZ is not following the recommendation anyway, so they should be. And you know, that kind of puts us in a bad situation where something CAPI adds is not supported for CAPZ because we've made this choice. And then we're kind of stuck where it's much harder to move at that point. So I think that's my main concern. I don't know. I'm very curious to know what Richard thinks about this, but I guess, Mike, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to comment on the one thing that you mentioned about consistency. From my point of view, you know, we're multi-cloud, multi-provider on, you know, AWS, VMware, and so AWS, Azure, VMware, and possibly some more coming in the future. So that consistency is definitely something that's really important to us. And I agree with what you were kind of saying about having to change later if it was forced would be definitely more painful. But as for, you know, the existing users, we're early enough in our journey that I can't have an opinion on that. But I definitely can understand that that would be painful for people that are far enough along on their journey.
Richard?
Richard?
Yeah, Cecile, I completely agree with you. So I think from the proposal point of view, I think there were two main recommendations. First recommendation is don't do what Kappa did, use the same resource kind for the control plane and the infra. So you have to have two different kinds. So that was I guess one of the main recommendations. And the second one, I guess, was more, you know, idealistic. You know, that the current implementations don't necessarily follow the separation of concerns between the different provider types, but you know, our current implementations do satisfy the contracts, and they work, and it works with, you know, your CAPZ works with cluster class. So yeah, I agree. It's a lot of effort for no real gain, or quite it's hard to quantify, you know, that consistency gain that we're, you know, when it currently works. So yeah, I see that point, and that's why there was that additional recommendation in there that, you know, if it currently works and it satisfies the contracts and the two recommendations, then, you know, there is no need to change. But yeah, I guess your final point is, yeah, painful changing now, but as soon as you graduate the API, and if you did decide to change, yeah, it would be a lot more painful. But I don't think there's ever going to be any huge differences between the different provider types, so the control plane and the cluster, which you satisfy those contracts now. So I can't see there being dramatic changes in those, because that would apply to every single provider, wouldn't it? Managed and unmanaged. So yeah, I guess it's just the appetite to do the work from my side. Yeah, but I think that helps.
Cecile?
So just hear me out, just one idea, and we don't have to make any decisions here, just floating an idea around. If we have to do work, if we take a step back and look at this as like from the cluster API community perspective, not just like every provider thinking of themselves, what we all want is consistency, right? And we want managed Kubernetes implementations that have good design across all the providers that are consistent. We're in a situation right now where Kappa has to make the change because of cluster class, right? And it sounds like y'all are going towards what KAB-Z is doing in the first time, like at first, that's going to be an easier change. And in the meantime, we're also doing KAB-G from scratch. That doesn't exist yet. So there's no, I guess, existing user. Have we considered, instead of making Kappa and KAB-Z move to go to what KAB-G now has, to instead make KAB-G just do what KAB-Z is doing from the start? And I see you smiling. I know that's something that's been considered, but I'm just curious, like, can we consider it again? Like, why not? Because it just seems like that would be the easiest solution, where we would all have working cluster class. It would be consistent. And from a design perspective, like, it is a bit idealistic to move like some fields into managed cluster, because like strictly speaking, those are more cluster than control plane. But from a managed Kubernetes service point of view, there's not really any differentiation, right? So I guess like, what's the thought on that?
Yeah. Sorry, I was smiling because I completely agree with you. It would be the easiest, quickest way to get consistency across all of the providers for managed. Definitely. I guess when we were discussing it, it just felt too easy. It felt like a bit of a cop out. Saying, oh yeah, this is the way it should be. Adhering to the contracts and the original idea with the separation concerns between the different provider types, and then with KAB-G, we could just go with the way that the other two could do. So yeah, we it hasn't started, so we could do that, to be honest, if we wanted to get that consistency short term, and then work out how we get to whether we even do get to that idealized view, because you don't always have to go there, do you? Actually, it just felt a bit too easy to go that route. Not because it's work wise, but we're saying this is the ideal way, where we want to get to, but we're not going to go there just because it's a bit too hard. But I think it's a valid point, though. I do definitely. Sorry, I'll stop talking.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is that the proposal was written with the expectation that Kappa would refactor according to a particular sort of set of recommendations. But on the ground, when that refactor work began, it sounds like it's not finished, but as of right now, the sense from the engineering folks who are actually going to do this work is that, in fact, the recommended approach is not going to be followed because of engineering time constraints or whatever. Is that fair?
I think it's fair to say that, yeah, definitely in the short term, it's too problematic, because we moved the API out of experimental, so we have to adhere to the deprecation policies of the API. So that's just going to cause us problems, put a whole bunch of constraints on us. So we will go to this same model as KAB-Z short term, because we can do that now, get cluster class working now. And then we did think we thought two options: that we would evolve the API over time in line with the Kubernetes API deprecation policies over a period of a year, 2 years, whatever that would be. But that's a lot of work, and it's a lot of work to just remember to move things at the right time in the releases, and and then we also, like I said, consider just creating completely new API types that adhere to that recommendation, and just put all new features into the new API types, and just keep the current ones, pinned in time, and deprecate them over 9 months or whatever it is. But yeah, I think realistically, we're going to move to your model first, and then just work out how we even going to get there. Even if it's like you said, Cecile, is it really worth the effort?
Well, I would speak to the, I think that I would second the notion that consistency is the most important, the most sort of valuable thing we can give to the community. And time is a variable in that. And so if there's a notion that Kappa will be introducing in a period of 18 months, 3 different ways to do managed EKS, then I think we're not actually being consistent. And the next, if we want to optimize for consistency, the next refactor that Kappa does, I think should be the model. So if that fact, you know what I mean? At some point, we think we're being consistent, but we're not actually being consistent. We're just referring to like a vaporware set of specifications. And that's not actually consistency. The other point I wanted to make is that I think that there is actually I write this in my doc, and feel free to disagree, anybody, but there is a downside to the decomposition between something called a cluster and something called a control plane with managed Kubernetes, because at least in AKS, there is no intrinsic, that's not an actual boundary. So we are in fact imposing that sort of additional set of abstractions on our users that don't exist in AKS as primitives. There's no such thing as a discrete cluster and a discrete control plane. This is not going to be true for every managed cluster or every Kubernetes offering in the ecosystem. So there could be competitive solutions that do offer their own opinions about, this is our architectural, these are our set of architectural primitives. But I think for AKS and for EKS, that's not a thing. There really is one sort of notion of a managed control plane, and then a discrete architectural boundary is the node pools or the worker nodes. But they're in that managed control plane offering. There's no, this is what your cluster is, and this is what your control plane is as distinct from one another. That's not a thing. That's a CAPI thing only. Cecile, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, I think I was going to say pretty much what you said, but I think just to answer what Richard said earlier, I personally am also like not, I definitely don't want us to choose something because it's easier. Like, I think we should make the right design choice, even if it's the harder one. I think that's more important. But in this case, I think we also have to be pragmatic, and I agree that consistency here is the biggest win. Like, that's what we want, right? That's why the proposal was made, that and getting cluster class to work. So if in practice we're going to have different implementations of providers, I don't think we're winning. I think we're actually losing. So I think the proposal should be something that realistically can be implemented with minimal pain by the providers if we're going to be consistent. Otherwise, like, I don't think the separation of concerns is really in itself as important as having a consistent implementation. That's just my take. Is it Jake? What's your first name? Sorry, John.
Yeah, it's John. So,
okay.
Hey, just my input from somebody that's trying to do some implementation across multiple cloud providers. And one of the things that actually has come up in our discussions about whether to use CAPI or something else, things like that, is in fact consistency. That is actually a key for us as a user and an operator. So that's super important. The other thing is in terms of some of the comments about there's really no difference between a control plane and a cluster. That may be true in terms of the actual implementation or something internal or something like that, whatever. But from an admin's perspective or a user's perspective, there is definitely a barrier there. There is definitely a delineation between the two, whether it's physical or logical or whatever it is. There is a difference there. So, and then finally, the other thing is, a couple of folks have mentioned things about deprecation policies and things like that. I'm not sure of the details of what's being thought out there, but all of these managed providers are still experimental, as far as I'm aware. So there is no deprecation policy. I think the key is to see if an agreement can be arrived at between all three of them, and then moving forward. So anyway, my 2 cents. I don't know if it's helpful or not, but
Very helpful. thank
Richard,
you.
are you raising your hand?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say one of the points that was just made, which is when I think of cluster, I think of it as the cluster infrastructure. So things like the networking and VPC and stuff. But I guess it sort of raised another point that we never fully got to the bottom of with the proposal or got agreement on, which is, especially when it comes to managed Kubernetes, is CAPI makes this assumption in the cluster infrastructure that the control plane load balancer or endpoint is provisioned via and reported via the cluster. Whereas in EKS, NAKS, that doesn't hold true, does it? It comes from the actual service. And then so we end up with this weird, reporting of the control plane back to the cluster just to satisfy the contract. So that's never been ideal. We discussed this over and over when we were writing the proposal, but there was, I don't think there was a huge amount of appetite to change that. And I guess I had a question for people around the consistency. When we talk about consistency, are we just talking about, are we happy with just consistency between the managed representations of clusters, across EKS, AKS, GKE, etc., or do we want to strive for consistency across all clusters, managed and unmanaged?
I have a thought on that. I'll let Zane go and then Mike, and then see if I'm next in line.
I don't have answer for Richard, but I can take on that later if someone has answer for Richard, and I can go after that.
Well, I don't have an answer. I have a response, which is to say, I think the way to solve that would be to move this into CAPI. So part of the challenge we have is solving this outside of CAPI. And so to that extent, the recommendation proposal that landed is very helpful to future implementers, because there is very little sort of core guidance from the cluster API itself. As you point out, you point out one instance, there's many instances where it doesn't really fit. It wasn't designed for managed. It wasn't designed for sort of split brain authority. I manage some aspects, the managed provider manages other aspects. So I think if we really want to talk about how to make this consistent up and down the stack, then we need to evolve CAPI to do that. And we need to make managed Kubernetes a first-class customer CAPI. So that would be my response to that particular thing.
I think Mike, you were next.
Well, I think Zane was next, and then he backed away. So Zane, you're back.
No, it's fine. Yeah, I think I can take on this one. I have to drop also. So just wanted to add few things from we have been using actually CAPI in production. I think probably the only one who are using that in production, and just wanted to say that we are okay with breaking changes in this sense. It's fine because we are a bit outlier in the sense of how we have been using this CAPI, and as long as it matters how we create the AKS cluster, that's the guarantee contract maybe from the CAPI team. We would like to agree the Azure SDK, how it is being created, it should follow the same calls as long as we are creating the same cluster. And yeah, I know. So as long as it's the same cluster that is being created, we can create the same objects. We can turn off the CAPI, bring up the new objects. We can do that part. We would be happy to do this for the community also if we change the types from one type to another one. So don't want the community to stop just because someone is using that in production. Because I think that is the whole point of using operators at that point, and that's why we are using that. Now, coming from the use that we are giving it, I think that's interesting because we are using CAPI objects for that, right? So we have this cluster object that is our main point of entry for all the automation that we are building on top of CAPI. Start from the cluster. We are not directly going to Azure Managed Control Plane. We find the child objects for that. We do have GKE cluster. We don't have GKE implementation, but we can create cluster object with the spec ignore, pause. That CAPI is not acting upon that. We just want to fill in some kube config to build automations on top of that, right? So as long as for us, it is important. it's the consistency from the CAPI point of view, right? So we will go the top level object and everything starts from there. So the cluster object, if it's the same, and all the child object, like we can discover those, right? We can see, we don't even really care at this point if it's control plane or cluster, as long as there's a like consistent way to reach out to those automation, right? And that has been working pretty well, I would say, as for now, because it is way better story than anything else we had. It other alternative for us is to build our own operators, and that will end up into something that looks like cluster object on CAPI, right? And it will be one way or another one. It will end up in the same field. So we are okay with that. And just a second, yeah, we are okay with the breaking changes also, as long as we say like the last version, the Azure SDK, the call that we are doing to create the managed cluster it's the same call as the new version is using, right? So as long as the cluster that are being created is the same. For example, just to give an example, if I create a cluster with Terraform and I don't add these, like in this example, the SSH public key, I cannot import it anymore to CAPC cluster, right? So this is not possible. But if I do create from like CAPC, and we have done this disaster recovery like experiments, we can do that, right? So all we need is the objects, and it will fill in the status because it will import that and it will work. So it is not like as a big issue or blocker issue, or should not be for anyone, even if they are using it in the production. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks. Mike?
I was just on the consistency question that Richard had asked. We're going to be focusing with CAPI on the managed control plane perspective primarily. So for us, it's consistency within the different managed control planes. Though my 2 cents would be, if I were to be using non-managed control planes, I'd be interested in consistency of the classes. So consistency within managed control planes and consistency inside of non-managed control planes, not consistency across the boundaries of the two.
That's great info. Thanks. John?
Yeah, I was actually going to sort of say the same thing that Mike just mentioned. So our perspective, we actually are doing both as well, managed and unmanaged. From our side, consistency across the managed ones, consistency across the unmanaged ones. Frankly, from my perspective, I don't see how you could have any consistency between managed and unmanaged in a sensical way, because they're very, very different, right? You have very, very different things that you have to do. So so I think that sounds like an awesome goal and something to strive for, but I think that would be really, really hard. I think you'd have a really hard time doing that. So.
Awesome. I see there's a side chat going on in chat about what breaking change means. Jack, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just clarifying
that?
that breaking changes, it's a pretty big deal. It would mean that the clusters you have currently running, when suddenly you revved CAPZ with the newer version, the newer breaking CRD API, that CAPZ would not work with those existing clusters. So there would have to be something else. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I think like that part I understand, but I don't see the need of like recreating cluster, right? So I agree, like there are existing CRDs that are there, right? And there are new CRDs that are there. As long as no one is acting on that, like we just turn off the operator, no one is gonna watch what we are gonna be doing. We can delete the old objects and create the new objects, bring up the new version with the new CRDs and like bring up the operator. This should be the exact same AKS cluster that is being created, right? Because we are not changing a new way to create cluster.
Well, are we talking about an AKS cluster whose lifecycle extends beyond? So a lifecycle, the cluster is created at time t with CAPZ v1, and then that cluster still exists. CAPZ v2 comes along, which has breaking changes in the CRD that abstracts away the AKS cluster. Are we expecting that existing AKS cluster to survive and then be managed by that newer version of the CRD? That can't happen.
Okay, I will take like, so this can happen actually, because for example, when we do have like, let's say like right now it's happening, it's not different from I have a CAPC AKS definition v1, right? And I don't have status filled in. and I go and create the cluster, and it will just reconcile because the objects still exist. The same fields are being populated in the spec, right? And it will just reconcile for the good. And this has been happening, right? We don't need a Kubernetes cluster to be up and running to always have like disaster recovery happening. The cluster can come and go. We will just create a new operator and everything like that. That will be like working. Now let's imagine that we have the V2, right? So what I'm talking about, the CRD V1 and V2, that can change absolutely. But the AKS definition, that is a JSON definition of the clusters that we are creating, if somehow the migration can manage to create the same definition with the V2 objects, it should just simply like work in that sense, right? So those CRDs are gone and CR objects are gone and new CR objects are coming. And that should be possible because we are not introducing a new way to create AKS cluster from the AKS like SDK, right? Those calls are exactly should be same in that sense, unless we are introducing some changes there, right? And I will stop now.
Right. So how are we going to convert? I guess the main point I'm thinking of is how do we convert the CRD at V1 to the CRD at V2 with the equivalent sort of conversion? That's net new. That would not be a part of the breaking change.
You don't have to. The customers will deal with that. Customers like me will deal with that, right? So you will just do the breaking change.
So you have an abstraction layer. You abstract away that from your platform, and you have conversion foo that can do that.
Yes, or we will build that, like, because we have no alternative at that point. Yeah.
Got it. Go ahead, Cecile.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like John is saying in the chat, if there's interest, we could also have like some migration script or something like some helper if this is like shared across multiple people. But yeah, essentially the main point here is that there would be no downtime, like zero downtime, because your clusters would still be running. You just temporarily would not manage their lifecycle, and then you would essentially adopt them via the new CRDs. So there is a path forward, and it's very good to see that Zane sees that path as an option. That's good to know. Saverio?
Yeah, so, and I apologize from the beginning if I say anything that is completely wrong, because I started getting myself informed on this project just starting yesterday. So I have a long Kubernetes experience with Terraform and on GKE and AKS. And if I can add to this conversation with some fresh eyes, like somebody that comes to this project like and sees everything with new eyes, I found very difficult to understand why we had two CRDs, one for the control plane and another for the cluster, because from a product point of view, and I think this was already said, GKE, AKS, they come like as a unique item, that there is not this split for the customers that will use these products. So, and I understand that here the goal is consistency. So now coming here and say, why don't you just merge these two CRDs into a single one, will make everybody screaming, because this is like a huge impact. But seriously, like, think about this, because I understand that this comes from a historical reason, or at least this is my understanding after 24 hours watching this stuff, that the initial project, if I understand correctly, was deploying a control plane based on kubeadm, and then this evolved to GKE and AKS. I mean, this is my understanding. If I'm wrong, I'm really sorry here, okay? But I just wanted to share with the eyes of somebody that is completely new and that works with customers using AKS. It would make, in the long term, everything very much simpler to have a single CRD. Because what I see here is that you want to move some elements from one CRD to another, and you are struggling to make everybody consistent, when having a single CRD will have implicit consistency, right? Because you won't have the problem of each implementation, the GKE one, the AKS one, and who put what value in the managed control plane and who in the managed cluster. A single CRD would be like the way to extreme consistency here. So that's just my 2 cents. And I'm sorry if I missed the point, because as I said, I'm very beginner on this project.
Thank you.
I,
That
for
was
one, think
great.
that's fantastic feedback. Go ahead, Cecile, if you want to
I
explain.
was just going to say the same thing. I was just going to say that's a great perspective. Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we do a very good job of explaining what the role of the cluster infrastructure provider is. So people do generally think it's about creation of the actual cluster, not the actual infrastructure that is required for the cluster. So yeah, I completely agree with that. And actually, when we were discussing the proposal, we one of the options we talked about was within the CAPI cluster, making the infrastructure ref optional. So if you've got a managed cluster, don't bother putting the infrastructure ref in there. So i.e. don't put the AWS or Azure managed cluster part in there, and just reference a control plane. But then that was sort of people didn't really like that idea at the time when we discussed it, just because it would require too many changes. We'd start to report the control plane back. But I guess also what I'm hearing is two things. One, that we need to investigate, like the migrations, how people have migrated, done significant changes to APIs via migrations in the past. But then also, I think John and Mike make a good point, is consistency. I think, Mike, you used the term class, but I don't want to confuse that with cluster class, but consistency between all of the managed providers and consistency between unmanaged providers. I think that is also an option, and then that would, if we did that, that would then enable us to get to consistency and managed quicker, because Kappa can just do the change back to what it was originally. CapG hasn't started, so it could follow the same pattern, and then bang, we got the three big managed providers all the same. But yeah, I'd be really interested in looking into the migrations as well.
Cecile?
Yeah, one thing I think that's a bit confusing right now is just the fact that everything in CapZ is in the managed control plane and nothing is in the cluster, even though from a product perspective, there is no control plane and you're creating a managed cluster. So it would almost make a bit more sense if it was reversed, where the managed control plane was kind of like doing nothing and it was just there to satisfy the CAPI contract, but the managed cluster is where it was at, right? Where that's what you're creating. And it's the fact that we're doing it the reverse, almost, I don't know, I feel like if we change the name, it would be even a bit easier to like accept, but yeah. I was also going to ask, what should we do for like, where should we take this? Like, what would be the next steps? I think it'd be valuable to get like the managed Kubernetes providers of CAPI into a room, maybe
100%.
to discuss further.
Yeah, my sense is that it sounds like Kappa is actively making a change, and so I think that's the most interesting near-term thing. And I would want to strongly advocate that change be reflective of the model of consistency that all providers follow. So CAPC is already right now in a position where we're open to making some changes. So if Kappa introduces changes that we can make in CapZ to form at least a precedent of consistency, and then if we can then advocate with CapG to do the same thing, then I think that we are in a best case scenario for the near term. I think long term, based on everything I'm hearing, that this is a CAPI. I think the learning I'm taking from the sort of at least up until now, the friction between the proposal landed in CAPI to solve this problem and the inability of the engineers to actually do so according to that proposal is because that proposal was not aimed at the right abstraction layer. And if we aim that proposal at CAPI itself, and if we implement managed cluster in CAPI as a first class CRD, that is the way to solve this problem for the sort of long term. But I agree with Cecile, like, let's all, the folks who really have a stake in this, let's get in a room and let's come up with a 3-year plan. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, speaking of getting people in the room, I know that we're trying to put something together for Contributor Day on Monday. I don't know if enough people or the right people will be around for that, or if it can be live streamed. But would that be the right place to start that conversation, or should we try to wait till the next CAPI meeting in a few weeks?
I would, if I were to vote, I would say next week is going to be tremendously distracting, and we should sort of empower that distraction, because it's a way for folks to run into each other and do ad hoc reconnaissance and all that kind of thing. But we can start back channeling like right now to find the right folks and sort of self-govern into a stable state of regular discussions. If that happens next week, I think that's fantastic. But I think that we probably shouldn't like set up a definite meeting with a definite agenda for Monday with everybody landing in Detroit from all over the world. But I'm arriving on Wednesday myself, so I'm happy to join any Zoom calls if folks are discussing this at any point. Richard, are you still raising your hand?
Yeah, I am. It's just a couple of things. If Kappa moves back to its original model, which is exactly the same as CAPC model is now, yeah, you wouldn't have to make any changes, which I think is good. Then I can then do CAPG in the same way, so it wouldn't be a problem. When we originally wrote the proposal, we had strong guidance from upstream CAPI that we couldn't make changes to upstream CAPI, and at the time it was only really Kappa saying it doesn't really fit, managed Kubernetes doesn't fit the current CAPI model. So I think if we want to push to make it upstream, then we have to come together as the three main providers, or and say ideally what we'd want and agree with ourselves before we take it upstream to CAPI. Say as a group of managed providers, we think these changes are needed, because prior to that, when this proposal was written, there was zero appetite to change upstream CAPI, and then the guidance was it has to fit the current model. So that's the only caveat I'd put to getting people together, is it probably should be driven by the actual providers that are going to implement this.
Great guidance. And thanks for sharing that backstory, Cecile.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think our main constraint right now in terms of time for CAPZ is that we're trying to graduate the AKS feature outside of experimental. And this discussion has been a blocker, like not doing the change, but deciding whether we're going to be doing the changes or not. We want to decide before we make any moves towards making it not experimental, because we don't want to say it's no longer experimental and then 2 months later, actually we're making breaking changes. So that's just the only thing, is like we're kind of waiting for that to happen before we can make it non-experimental. But I think it would be a good game plan if we all started with like consistency in what we know works with cluster class and what CAPZ has, since that would work for Kappa too, and then take it from there and see how we can make it more like make CAPI fit, and get rid of the useless CRD, maybe, as a unified front, like you said. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for coming to our office hours. This is really, really useful. I'm glad you came and we were able to have this discussion. All right, I think we're almost at time, so let's punt the graduation discussion for next time, Jack, since we probably need to do some thinking between now and then.
Sounds good to me.
Cool. And then just a reminder that next week, office hours are going to be canceled due to KubeCon. So we'll see you all in 2 weeks. And if anyone's around at KubeCon, I'll be there. So hit me up. We can meet in person. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Nice to
Yeah,
meet you guys.
see a lot of folks in Detroit.
See ya.
And if you want to be, please reach out over Slack. I think most of us will have Slack on the ground. We can include lots of folks who aren't in Detroit in those conversations with laptops and Zoom and all that kind of thing. So.
Bye.